He married me without love, but the moment I lifted my veil, he looked like he had seen a ghost. The chandelier light above me felt too bright, too heavy, like it was pressing down on my shoulders instead of illuminating the room, and I remember thinking that even the air inside that cathedral didn't belong to me, it belonged to him, to Victor Romano. The man waiting at the altar like this was just another acquisition, another contract signed in silence. My heels echoed against the marble floor as I walked forward, each step measured, each breath shallow, my fingers trembling just enough that I had to tighten them around the bouquet to keep anyone from noticing, though no one was really looking at me, not the guests in their tailored suits, not the women in silk dresses whispering behind gloved hands, because this wasn't a wedding people attended for love, it was a wedding people attended to witness power. I could feel his presence before I truly saw him, a stillness in the room that didn't exist anywhere else, like everything around him knew to stay quiet, and when my eyes finally lifted, I saw him clearly for the first time, 65 years old, sharp lines carved into his face like time had tried to break him and failed, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his posture unyielding, his gaze not warm or curious but distant, calculating, as if he were evaluating risk instead of standing across from his bride. I wasn't here because I chose this. I was here because choices had run out weeks ago when numbers on paper turned into threats whispered behind closed doors. And somehow my name became the solution, my life reduced to a signature that could settle everything, and I told myself I could survive anything if I stayed quiet, if I stayed invisible, if I never gave him a reason to actually see me. The ceremony began but the words blurred together, vows that meant nothing, promises neither of us intended to keep, and I focused on the small things instead. The way the light caught the edge of his cufflinks, the faint scent of expensive cologne mixed with something colder, something controlled, the sound of my own heartbeat louder than the officiant's voice, until everything narrowed to one single moment, one single command spoken calmly into the silence: you may lift the veil, and time didn't stop, it slowed, stretching thin as my hands rose, fingers brushing the soft fabric that had hidden me this entire time, and for a second I hesitated, because something deep inside me whispered that once I did this, nothing would stay the same, not for me, not for him. Not for whatever this arrangement was supposed to be. I lifted it anyway, slowly, letting the fabric fall back, letting the light reach my face, and I looked up at him fully for the first time, expecting indifference, expecting that same cold distance, but what I saw instead made my breath catch in a way I couldn't explain, because Victor Romano didn't look like a man in control anymore. His eyes locked onto mine as if they recognized something they shouldn't, his expression tightening, his color draining just slightly, subtle enough that no one else would notice, but I did. I saw the exact moment something shifted, something broke beneath that perfectly composed surface, and in that instant, I realized something far more dangerous than marrying a man like him. I realized he wasn't looking at a stranger, he was looking at me like I belonged to a memory he thought was buried, and for the first time since this all began, I wasn't the one who felt powerless, because whatever he saw in me, it shook him, and that meant I was no longer invisible. The silence did not break when the veil fell, it deepened, thick and suffocating, as if the entire room had inhaled at the same time and forgotten how to breathe, and I felt it in the way Victor Romano's gaze stayed locked on mine, not drifting, not blinking, just fixed like he was searching for something buried under my skin, something he could not quite accept was real. His hand, the one that had been resting calmly at his side moments ago, tightened slightly, the subtle shift enough to catch my attention, enough to tell me that whatever control he prided himself on had just slipped, even if only for a second, and that second stretched longer than anything else in the ceremony, longer than the vows, longer than the walk down the aisle, longer than the life I had left behind to stand here. The officiant cleared his throat softly, a polite attempt to pull the moment back on track, but Victor did not respond immediately, and I could feel the eyes of every guest flicking between us, confusion hidden beneath practiced smiles, because powerful men were not supposed to hesitate, they were not supposed to look uncertain, and yet there it was, unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look closely enough. Finally, he moved. Just enough to take my hand, his touch firm but colder than I expected, not gentle, not cruel, just deliberate, like he needed to confirm that I was real, that I was not some illusion his mind had created, and when his fingers closed around mine, I felt a faint tremor pass through him before it disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced again by that controlled stillness that defined him. "Continue," he said quietly, his voice low but steady, and the ceremony resumed as if nothing had happened, as if the man who commanded entire rooms with a single glance had not just been shaken by the sight of his own bride. I tried to focus on the words being spoken, on the promises neither of us believed, but my mind kept returning to that look, that moment when his composure cracked, and I realized something else, something even more unsettling than his reaction. I realized that he had not been looking at me with curiosity, he had been looking at me with recognition, the kind that came from memory, not introduction. When it was time to exchange rings, his movements were precise again, controlled, slipping the band onto my finger without hesitation, but his eyes never left my face, studying every detail, tracing something invisible that only he could see, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the room full of strangers. It was deeper than that, like standing in front of someone who already knew parts of your story you had never told. When I placed the ring on his hand, my fingers brushed against his skin for a fraction longer than necessary, and I felt it again, that tension beneath the surface, like a storm held tightly in place, and I knew then that whatever he had seen when I lifted that veil, it had not gone away, it was still there, sitting between us, unspoken but undeniable. The ceremony ended with polite applause, the kind that echoed off the high ceilings without warmth, and as the guests began to move, to talk, to pretend everything was exactly as it should be, Victor leaned closer, just enough that only I could hear him, his voice barely above a whisper, controlled but edged with something sharper underneath. "Where are you from, Emily?" The question was simple, almost casual, but the way he said my name made it feel heavier, like he was testing it against something in his memory, measuring it against a past I did not understand, and for a second I forgot the answer I had repeated so many times before, the safe version of my life, the one that brought me here, because suddenly it felt like the truth mattered more than the story, and I could not tell which one he was asking for. I swallowed, steadying my voice as best as I could, and gave him the answer he was supposed to hear, the one that fit the file he already had on me. But as I spoke, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, not in suspicion, but in quiet certainty, like he already knew I was leaving something out, like he had seen enough to understand that whatever connection he felt was not an accident. And when he finally pulled back, the faintest trace of color still missing from his face, I realized this was no longer just a marriage of convenience, it was the beginning of something neither of us had planned, something tied to a past that had not stayed buried, no matter how much time had passed. The reception felt louder than it should have, voices layered over music that sounded expensive but hollow, laughter that echoed without warmth, and I stood beside Victor as if I had always belonged there, as if I understood the unspoken rules of a world built on power and silence, but every second stretched thin with awareness because I could feel him watching me even when he was not looking directly at me, like his attention had weight, like it followed me across the room no matter where I turned. People approached us in a steady stream, men with firm handshakes and careful smiles, women with polite compliments that never quite reached their eyes, all of them addressing him first, always him, their respect edged with something deeper, something that made them choose their words with precision, and when they spoke to me, it was different, softer, curious, as if they were trying to understand why I was standing beside a man like him, what role I played in a story they did not have access to. I answered when spoken to, kept my voice steady, my posture composed, repeating the version of myself that had been prepared, but it felt thinner now, less convincing, because every time I glanced at Victor, I saw that same quiet calculation in his expression, that same searching intensity that had not faded since the ceremony ended. He did not touch me more than necessary, did not perform affection for the room, but he stayed close, close enough that I could sense every subtle shift in him, the way his shoulders tightened when certain names were mentioned, the way his gaze flickered briefly when someone referenced the past, and I began to notice something else, something small but impossible to ignore, the way a few of the older guests looked at me twice, their expressions changing just slightly, like recognition brushing against memory before they pushed it away. It unsettled me in a way I could not explain, because I had spent years making sure I was unremarkable, forgettable, someone who could pass through rooms without leaving a trace, and yet here, in this place, surrounded by people who knew far more than they said, I felt like I was being seen in pieces, fragments of something I did not fully understand. At one point, a woman in her late 50s approached, elegant and composed, her silver hair pinned perfectly in place, and when her eyes met mine, she paused for just a fraction of a second too long, her smile faltering before she recovered. "You look familiar," she said softly, almost to herself, and before I could respond, Victor stepped in smoothly, his voice calm but firm, redirecting the conversation with practiced ease, and the moment passed, but the tension it left behind did not. Later, when the crowd shifted and the music softened, he finally spoke to me again, not for the room, not for anyone else, just for me, his voice low enough that it barely carried beyond the space between us. "Who was your mother, Emily?" The question landed differently this time, heavier, more direct, and I felt something tighten in my chest because this was not casual curiosity anymore, this was intent. This was him following a thread he had already begun to trace. I hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Enough for him to notice, enough for his gaze to sharpen slightly as he watched me choose my words, and I gave him the answer I had always given, the name that had never caused anyone to look twice, the story that had never raised questions, but even as I spoke, I knew it was not enough for him. I could see it in the way his expression did not change, in the way he held my gaze a second longer than necessary, as if he were listening for something beneath the surface, something I was not saying. He nodded once, slowly, like he was accepting the answer for now, but not believing it entirely, and then he turned away, addressing someone else with the same composed authority he had shown all evening, leaving me standing there with the quiet realization settling deeper into my bones that this was no longer just about survival, it was about something else entirely, something tied to a past that was beginning to surface piece by piece, whether I was ready for it or not. And as I looked across the room, catching my reflection briefly in one of the tall mirrors lining the wall, I felt a strange, unsettling thought take shape, because for the first time, I was not entirely sure that the life I had been living was the full truth, and whatever Victor Romano had seen in me, it was not something that could be hidden for much longer. The drive to his estate was quieter than the ceremony, quieter than the reception, and somehow that silence felt heavier than everything that had come before, because there were no more distractions, no more polite conversations to hide behind, just the low hum of the engine and the faint glow of city lights fading into darkness as we moved farther away from everything familiar. I sat beside him in the back seat, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the reflection of passing streetlights slide across the window like fragments of something I could not quite hold on to, and I could feel his presence next to me without needing to look, steady, controlled, but not as distant as before, not as untouched, because something had shifted between us the moment that veil lifted and neither of us knew how to ignore it anymore. He had not spoken since we left, not a single word, but it did not feel like indifference, it felt like calculation, like he was piecing something together in his mind, something that required silence to fully form, and I wondered how much he already knew, how much he suspected, how much he had already begun to uncover without me realizing it. When the car finally slowed and turned through iron gates that opened without hesitation, I lifted my eyes and saw the estate for the first time, sprawling across acres of land. Lights glowing softly against the night, everything about it designed to impress without needing to prove anything, the kind of place that did not ask for attention because it already owned it, and I felt that same quiet pressure settle into my chest again, the reminder that I had stepped into a world that did not belong to me, no matter what ring sat on my finger. The car came to a stop, the door opened, and cool air brushed against my skin as I stepped out, my heels pressing against smooth stone, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness around us, and for a moment I hesitated, just a fraction of a second, before moving forward, because crossing that threshold felt like crossing into something irreversible. Inside, the house was even more imposing, high ceilings, polished floors, soft lighting that made everything look untouched, like time moved differently here, slower, more controlled, and I followed him without being told. My steps quieter now, my awareness sharper, noticing the details I would have ignored before, the way staff moved quickly but silently, the way doors opened before we reached them, the way no one questioned anything, because in this place, he did not need to give explanations. We reached a wide hallway lined with doors, and he stopped, turning to face me fully for the first time since we left the reception, and there it was again, that look, not cold, not distant, but searching, like he was standing on the edge of a memory he could not quite reach, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, heavy with everything that had not been said. "You will have your own room," he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, as if he had already decided that distance was the safest choice, the most logical one, and I nodded slightly, not surprised, not offended, because this had never been about closeness, it had never been about anything that resembled a real marriage. A woman appeared quietly beside us, her presence calm and efficient, and he gave a small nod in her direction before turning back to me. "If you need anything, you ask." Simple words. But the way he said them carried something more, something unspoken. Like a promise or a warning, I could not tell which. I followed her down the hallway, the soft sound of my steps blending into the quiet around us, and when the door to my room opened, I paused again, taking in the space, large, carefully arranged, everything in place as if it had been waiting for me, but it did not feel like mine. It felt like something prepared, something expected, and as I stepped inside, I could not shake the feeling that I had not just entered a new life, I had stepped into a story that had already begun long before I arrived, and somewhere behind me, I could still feel his gaze lingering, even without turning around, as if he had not finished looking, as if he was still trying to understand why I felt so familiar, and why that familiarity refused to stay buried. I did not sleep that night, not really, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, that exact moment when something in him shifted, when recognition replaced indifference, and it stayed with me like a quiet echo I could not silence. The room they gave me was too perfect, too still, the kind of place where nothing felt lived in, and I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed instead of lying down, my fingers tracing the edge of the ring he had placed on my hand, the metal cool against my skin, a constant reminder that everything about this was real, no matter how unreal it felt. The silence inside the estate was different from the silence outside. It was controlled, intentional, like even the walls understood the importance of keeping things contained, and I wondered how many secrets had been held here, how many stories had been buried beneath polished floors and quiet hallways. Sometime after midnight, I stood and moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out across the grounds, the faint glow of security lights outlining the distance, and for a moment I felt very small in a place that was designed to make everything else feel that way, and yet beneath that feeling was something else, something sharper, because for the first time in years, I was not entirely certain who I was supposed to be in this story. The sound of footsteps outside my door made me turn, my breath catching slightly before I could stop it, and when there was a soft knock, I hesitated, just long enough to remind myself that this was my reality now. Before I crossed the room and opened it, Victor stood there, not imposing in the way he had been earlier, not surrounded by people or expectations, just him, alone, and for a second neither of us spoke, the quiet stretching between us again. But this time it felt different, less like control and more like uncertainty. "I need you to come with me," he said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the authority he carried so easily in front of others, and I studied his expression, searching for the distance I had seen before, but it was not there, replaced instead by something I could not quite name, something closer to urgency. I nodded without asking questions, because I already understood that whatever this was, it mattered more than explanations, and I followed him out into the hallway, my steps soft against the floor as we moved through the quiet house. He led me down a different corridor this time, one that felt older somehow, less polished, the air heavier with something I could not define, and when we stopped in front of a door at the very end, he paused, his hand hovering just slightly before he pushed it open. The room inside was dimly lit, not unused, but not part of the main living space either, and my eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the details piece by piece, shelves lined with objects that looked untouched by time, a desk near the window, and on the wall, framed photographs arranged with careful precision. I stepped forward without realizing it, drawn by something I could not explain, and as I moved closer, my breath slowed, then stopped entirely, because the woman in the photographs looked back at me with a familiarity that felt impossible to ignore, her features soft but unmistakable, her eyes the same shape as mine, the same shade, the same quiet intensity, and for a second the world around me faded, leaving only that image and the realization forming in the space between my thoughts. Behind me, I could feel Victor watching, not saying anything, not interrupting, just waiting, and when I finally turned to look at him, I saw it clearly, the answer he had already reached, the truth he had been circling since the moment he saw my face, and I understood then that whatever connection he had felt was not imagined, it was not coincidence, it was something real, something rooted in a past that had never truly disappeared, and as the silence settled between us once again, heavier now with meaning, I realized that I was no longer just part of a contract, I was part of something he had been searching for without even knowing it, something that was about to change everything for both of us. Who is she? I heard my own voice before I realized I had spoken, quiet but unsteady, the question pulling itself out of me as I stared at the photograph, unable to look away from the woman whose face felt too familiar, too close to my own reflection to be coincidence. Victor did not answer immediately, and that silence said more than anything else could have, because it was not the silence of someone who did not know. It was the silence of someone deciding how much truth to give, how much to hold back, and when he finally stepped closer, I felt the shift in the room again, that subtle change in the air that followed him everywhere. Her name was Evelyn, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edges he carried in public, and I felt something tighten in my chest at the sound of it, not because I recognized the name, but because of the way he said it, like it still mattered, like it had never stopped mattering. I turned back to the photograph, studying the details more closely this time, the way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, the calm in her expression, the quiet strength in her eyes, and I realized that it was not just resemblance, it was something deeper, something that could not be explained by chance alone. You knew her, I said, more certain now, and when I looked at him again, his gaze did not waver, but there was something there, something heavy and distant, like memory pulling him backward whether he wanted it or not. A long time ago, he replied, and the simplicity of the answer made it feel incomplete, like a door left half open, enough to see inside but not enough to understand what was hidden behind it. I stepped closer to the wall, my fingers brushing lightly against the frame, careful, almost hesitant, as if touching it might confirm something I was not ready to face, and I felt a strange pull in my chest, something unfamiliar and unsettling, like a memory that was not mine trying to surface. She looks like me, I said quietly, not as a question this time, but as a statement. And the word seemed to settle into the space between us with a weight that neither of us could ignore. Victor exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried something with it, something close to resignation, and for the first time since I had met him, he did not try to deflect or redirect, he simply stood there, acknowledging the truth that had already revealed itself. That is why I could not look away, he said. And there was no denial in his voice, no attempt to soften it, just a quiet admission that felt more honest than anything he had said so far. I swallowed, my thoughts racing now, trying to piece together something that made sense, something that could explain why I was standing here, why I felt this strange connection to a woman I had never met, and why the man in front of me, the one who had built his life on control, looked like he was standing on the edge of something he could not fully contain. Where is she now? I asked, and this time the question felt heavier, because I already sensed the answer would not be simple, would not be easy, and for a moment, he did not respond, his gaze shifting slightly, not away from me, but inward, like he was looking at something only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost distant. She is not here, and the way he said it left no room for interpretation, no space for hope or uncertainty, just a finality that settled into the room. Like a shadow, I looked back at the photograph again, at the woman who felt so familiar and yet so far away, and I realized that whatever connection existed between us, it was not something that could be ignored or explained away, it was something that had been waiting to be uncovered, something tied to a past that neither of us fully understood yet. And as I stood there, caught between what I knew and what I was beginning to suspect, one thought rose above everything else, clear and unavoidable. If she looked like me, and he had known her, then this was not just coincidence, this was something deeper, something that meant my life had never been as simple as I believed, and whatever truth was hidden behind that name, behind that face, it was about to change everything I thought I knew about myself. The word settled into me slower than anything else he had said. Not here. It echoed quietly, repeating itself until it began to mean something more than absence, something closer to loss, and I felt it in the way the room seemed to close in slightly, like the walls themselves were holding on to that truth. I did not know Evelyn, not really, but standing there, looking at her face, hearing her name spoken with that kind of weight, I felt something unfamiliar press against my chest, something that did not belong to logic or coincidence, something that felt almost like grief without memory. How long ago? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt, because if this was real, if this connection was more than resemblance, then time mattered, it mattered more than anything else, and Victor's gaze shifted slightly, not avoiding mine, but not fully meeting it either, like he was measuring the distance between then and now, between who he had been and who he had become. 25 years, he said finally, and the number landed heavier than I expected, because it was not just a span of time, it was a possibility, a line that connected past to present in a way I could not ignore, and my mind moved quickly, too quickly, tracing patterns, asking questions I was not sure I wanted answers to. I turned back to the photograph again, studying it with new awareness, searching for details I might have missed before, something that could confirm or deny the thought forming quietly in the back of my mind, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. The resemblance was not vague, it was precise, deliberate in ways that could not be dismissed. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, even the way she seemed to hold herself within the frame, calm but strong, it was all too close, too exact. Did she have a family? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, and this time Victor's reaction was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, his posture tightening just slightly, his attention sharpening, like I had touched something he had not expected me to reach. For a moment he did not answer, and that silence stretched again, but it was different now, more deliberate, more cautious, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same careful control. She had no one, he said, and something about the way he said it made me hesitate, because it did not sound like certainty, it sounded like something he had told himself, something he had believed because it was easier than questioning it. I turned fully to face him, the weight of the moment pressing down harder now, and I realized that whatever truth we were circling, it was no longer distant, it was right here, just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. Then how do you explain me? I asked quietly, and the words seemed to hang between us, heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because this was no longer about resemblance, it was about connection, about something that could not be explained by chance or coincidence. Victor did not respond right away, but this time the silence was not empty, it was filled with something shifting, something breaking apart and reforming, and I saw it in his eyes, the moment when doubt entered, when certainty gave way to possibility, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked uncertain in a way that could not be hidden behind control or authority. He stepped closer, not invading, not overwhelming, just close enough that I could see every detail of his expression, every flicker of thought as it passed through him, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, almost careful. That is what I intend to find out, and there was something different in the way he said it, not a command, not a decision made from power, but a question he could not ignore. I felt my breath slow, my thoughts steadying just enough to recognize what this meant, because whatever answer he found, it would not just change his past, it would change my entire life, everything I believed about where I came from, everything I thought I understood about myself. I looked back at the photograph one last time, at Evelyn's face, at the quiet familiarity that no longer felt accidental, and I understood something then, something simple but impossible to undo. This was not just about him recognizing me, this was about me discovering something I had never known, something that had been hidden in plain sight my entire life, and as I turned away from the wall, meeting his gaze again, I realized that whatever truth waited for us, it was already too late to step back from it, because some connections do not fade with time, they wait, silent and patient, until the moment they are seen again. The room felt smaller after that, not because it had changed, but because the truth inside it had, pressing closer, tightening around every thought I tried to hold steady, and I realized there was no way to leave this conversation unchanged, no version of my life that would still feel the same after this moment. Victor did not move away, did not return to the distance he had kept before, and that alone told me more than words could, because a man like him did not stay close without reason, he did not allow uncertainty to linger unless it mattered, and whatever he saw in me had already crossed that line. There are records, he said after a moment, his voice measured but quieter now, as if the room itself demanded something softer, things that can confirm this, and I understood. Immediately what he meant: documents, timelines, pieces of a past that could either connect us or break the possibility entirely. But even as he spoke, I felt something resist inside me, not fear exactly, but hesitation, because once the truth was clear, there would be no returning to the version of myself that existed before tonight. I nodded slowly, because I knew he was right, because I knew this was no longer something that could be ignored, and yet my eyes drifted back to the photograph. Again, to Evelyn's face, to the quiet strength in her expression, and I wondered what her life had been like, what choices she had made, what had led her to intersect with a man like Victor Romano, and more importantly, what had happened after, what happened to her. I asked, and this time the question felt different, not just curiosity, but something deeper, something closer to need, because if I was connected to her, then her story was not separate from mine, it was part of it whether I understood it or not. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough for me to notice, enough to tell me that this was not a question he answered easily. And for a moment I thought he might deflect again, might return to that controlled distance, but he did not. He stayed where he was, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable in a way that felt more like restraint than indifference. She left, he said finally, and the simplicity of it felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its ending, and I held his gaze, waiting, because I knew there was more, there had to be more, but he did not continue right away, and in that pause, I saw something I had not seen before, not just memory, but regret, faint and controlled, but present. And you never saw her again, I said softly, finishing the thought he had not spoken, and his silence confirmed it more clearly than words could have, because a man like him did not leave things unfinished unless they had been taken out of his control. I looked back at the photograph once more, at the woman who had somehow become the center of everything in a matter of minutes, and I felt that strange pull again, stronger now, sharper, like something inside me was responding to a truth I had not yet fully understood. If she left, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully, then you do not know what happened after. And this time when I looked at him, I saw it clearly, the realization settling in alongside mine, the possibility expanding in a way that could not be contained by logic alone. He exhaled quietly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement, like he had reached the same conclusion and could not dismiss it anymore, and for the first time, the distance between us felt different, not defined by power or control, but by something shared, something uncertain and unresolved. No, he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying something deeper beneath it, I do not, and that admission changed everything, because it meant the past he believed he understood was incomplete, and the life I believed I knew might have been built on something missing. I felt my heartbeat slow, not calming, but steadying into something more focused, because the fear I had felt earlier was shifting into something else, something stronger, something that needed answers more than it feared them, and I realized that whatever this connection was, it was not just his to uncover, it was mine too. I stepped away from the wall, from the photographs, from the version of myself that had existed before this room, and as I met his gaze again, I understood something with quiet certainty. This was no longer about why he married me, it was about why I was here at all, why our paths had crossed in a way that felt too precise to be random. And as the silence settled between us once more, it no longer felt empty, it felt like the space before something is revealed, something that has been waiting long enough to finally be seen. We stood there longer than either of us expected, the silence no longer uncomfortable but heavy with meaning, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something neither of us had fully said yet, and I realized that this was the moment where everything shifted from possibility into truth, not confirmed, not proven, but undeniable in a way that could not be ignored. Victor moved first, not away from me, but toward the desk, his movements slower than before, more deliberate, as if every step carried weight, and when he opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, I felt something tighten in my chest again, because this was it, the beginning of answers, the part where uncertainty started to take shape. He placed the folder on the desk but did not open it right away, his hand resting lightly against the edge as he looked at me, not with authority, not with distance, but with something closer to caution, like he understood that whatever was inside would not just affect him. It would affect me just as deeply. If we open this, he said quietly, there is no going back, and I understood exactly what he meant, because once the truth was clear, there would be no version of my life untouched by it, no way to pretend that tonight had not changed everything. I stepped closer without hesitation, because whatever fear I had felt before had already been replaced by something stronger, something that needed to know. And I nodded once, steady, certain, because the only thing more dangerous than the truth was not knowing it. He opened the folder slowly, the sound of paper shifting soft but sharp in the quiet room, and I moved beside him, my eyes scanning the contents, lines of information, dates, names, fragments of a story I had never been part of until now, and then I saw it, a date that aligned too closely, a record that should not have mattered but suddenly did, and beneath it, a note, simple but clear, indicating a disappearance, a departure without trace, and something else, something that made my breath catch, a mention of a child, unconfirmed, undocumented, but present enough to be written down. I felt the world narrow again, not collapsing, but focusing, everything else fading into the background as that single detail settled into place, connecting pieces I had not known were connected, and I turned my head slowly to look at him, my thoughts aligning into something clear, something impossible to ignore. "She did not leave alone," I said, my voice quieter than before but steadier, because this was no longer a question, it was a realization, and Victor did not deny it. Did not interrupt, he simply looked at the page, his expression tightening in a way that confirmed everything I needed to know. The silence that followed was different from before, not uncertain, not searching, but filled with understanding, because the truth had finally taken form, incomplete but undeniable, and I felt it settle into me with a strange sense of clarity. Because the life I thought I had lived, the identity I believed was mine, it had always been missing something, something that had now been found. I looked back at the photograph on the wall, at Evelyn's face, at the quiet familiarity that had started all of this, and I understood it fully now, not just resemblance, not just coincidence, but connection, real and unbreakable, something that had existed long before I knew it. Victor closed the folder slowly, his hands steady again. But the change in him remained, subtle but permanent, because this was not just about his past anymore, it was about ours, intertwined in a way neither of us had planned, and when he looked at me this time, there was no distance left, no uncertainty, just a quiet acknowledgement of what stood between us. "We will find the rest," he said, his voice calm but certain, and I nodded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I already knew, because whatever answers were still hidden, they were no longer out of reach. I stood there, in a place that had never been mine, beside a man who had never been meant to be part of my life, and I felt something settle deep inside me, not fear, not doubt, but understanding, because sometimes the past does not stay buried, it waits, shaping everything in silence until the moment it is finally seen. And when that moment comes, it does not ask permission, it changes everything.